Want cleaner cuts and better results on your models? Let's talk sprue cutters. Hey everyone, welcome to part 3 of my tutorial series. Before we dive into working with a sprue, I'm going to show you the difference between sprue cutters, starting with the most basic and ending with a precision tool that can take your builds to the next level. Stick around, because the right cutter can make a huge difference in your model's finish. If you enjoy this video, don't forget to hit the like button. It really helps the channel grow. Subscribe so you won't miss part 4, where we'll keep building and go even deeper into pro modeling tips. Alright, let's start with the very first tool, my budget sprue cutter. This one is actually my very first cutter ever, made by Tamiya. Now, I'm going to cut a small piece so you can see the result. The part is tiny, and honestly it's a bit tricky to capture in a photo, but you'll get the idea. The cut is, well, uneven, and depending on how hard the plastic is, it can sometimes be even worse. I've had cases where it left angled cuts, about 45 degrees on both sides of the part. Not exactly ideal. Let's move to the second sprue cutter, also from Tamiya. This one is a slightly better version. The blades are sharper, and the cutting angle is improved compared to the budget one. The result is a little better. Cleaner? Yes. Perfect? Not quite. And you still hear that noticeable clipping sound every time it cuts. Why? Well, that's because the blade edges are around 30 to 35 degrees. That angle creates more resistance as it goes through the plastic, which is why you hear and feel that snap. And now the star of the show, my godhand sprue cutter. This one is in a completely different league. The first thing you'll notice, there's no clipping sound at all. It slices through the plastic almost effortlessly with zero resistance. The cut is absolutely straight, completely flat, and perfectly clean. No extra sanding needed in most cases. The magic is in the blade design. One blade is totally flat, no angle whatsoever, and the other is a standard cutting blade. That flat side is what actually does the cutting, and it works because of simple physics. The side with less resistance becomes the one doing all the work. I reach for this cutter whenever I need to cut as close to the part as possible. It saves me a ton of time later during cleanup, and I'll talk more about that in the post-cleaning section of this video. But there's one big drawback. You can't use it on clear parts. That flat blade is too delicate for harder plastics. How do I know? Well, I found out the hard way. I broke it. Only later, after translating the original Japanese text on the box, did I realize the instructions literally warned about it. By then, it was way too late. Now let's move on to the sprue. The first thing I want to say, and this is important, never try to parts off the sprue. Even if the connection points look thin or weak, twisting can damage the part. Instead, always use a sprue cutter. That's what this section of the video is all about. When cutting apart from the sprue, don't make your first cuts too close to the part itself. Always start with your cuts a little bit away from the edge of the part, maybe 1 to 2 millimeters. For example, if this seat has 2 connection points, cut both of them slightly away from the part. Also, make sure the flat side of the sprue cutter is facing the part. If you cut too close right away, there's a risk of removing a tiny piece of the part itself. This is why I showed earlier that a standard sprue cutter doesn't always make a perfectly straight cut. The safest way is to cut one side first, then hold the part gently with your fingers before cutting the second side. This helps prevent it from snapping off unexpectedly. Of course, accidents happen, but no one wants to waste time repairing a broken piece when you could be moving straight on to cleanup and painting. Once the part is free from the sprue, you can go in for a closer cut, about 0.5 to 1 millimeter from the part, again with the flat side of the cutter facing toward it. This will make the final cleanup easier with your hobby knife and sanding tools. Next, take your hobby knife, and here's my tip. Always start with a fresh blade for every new build, and replace it as soon as it becomes dull. If you cut the way I'm showing, using one hand, it's almost impossible to cut yourself. I can't fully explain why, but your fingers instinctively move out of the way when the blade is in the same hand. However, remember, one hand can still cut the other, so always be careful. Keep the blade parallel to the surface you're cleaning. No angles. Let the blade do the work. The knife's natural bevel will clean the leftover nubs smoothly. I go over all sides with the hobby knife before moving to sanding. For sanding, I like to start with 400 grit sandpaper or a sanding stick. On a slightly rounded surface, I use small circular motions until it's flat and smooth. You can check your progress by lightly running your fingernail across the spot. If your nail catches, keep sanding. Once the area is flat, move to 600 or 800 grit to remove the scratches left by the 400 grit. You could also start cleanup with 600 or 800 grit, but it will take longer. For curved surfaces, I prefer padded sanding sticks because they adapt to the shape without removing surface details. And here's a bonus tip. On glossy plastic surfaces, I like to lightly sand everywhere I can reach. This gives the paint something to grip, which helps, especially if you plan to mask the part later for multicolor painting. It reduces the risk of the paint peeling when you remove masking tape. Now the part is clean, smooth, properly prepped and ready, or almost ready for paint. Let me show you another example. This time it's an exhaust system. The process is the same. Cut the part off the sprue and clean up all the connection points. However, this part, like many similar parts in other kits, has mold lines, as you can see in my picture. I highly recommend removing these lines because they'll look ugly once painted, especially if you're painting silver or chrome. Those colors highlight every little imperfection, even tiny scratches. The mold line runs along the entire part on both sides. I usually start by gently scraping it off with a hobby knife, then follow up with 400 grit sandpaper or a sanding stick to smooth the surface. After that, I finish with 600 grit, or even better in this case, 800 grit sandpaper to remove all the scratches left by the knife and the 400 grit. Here's the result. I apply the same procedure to all mold lines on every side of the part. Remember, the goal is to make the surface as smooth as a real car exhaust system. In some cases, mold lines might be hidden once the part is installed, so whether you want to spend the time cleaning them up is totally your choice. For me, building a model is a passion and a rewarding journey from start to finish, And that's exactly what I'll be sharing throughout these YouTube videos. And here's the final result. All the mold lines are removed, and the surface is smooth and ready. Here's another quick example. This part also has mold lines running across its entire surface. Since it will be painted black, removing these lines is optional, but I still recommend doing it for a cleaner finish. This part is much smaller, so good knife skills will help speed up the process. Here's the result. Now that I've covered cleanup on ordinary plastic parts, let's move on to clear parts. The process is basically the same as with regular plastic parts. Cut the part a little way from the connection points when removing it from the sprue. However, be extra careful not to scratch these clear parts, especially windshields, because repairing scratches on clear plastic is difficult and time-consuming. Once you cut off the part you need, put the sprue back in a safe place. Also, keep in mind that manufacturers often use metal staples to seal the plastic packaging. Make sure to remove and discard those staples immediately before working on the clear part sprue, as they can easily scratch your perfect clear parts. Another important tip, don't use that expensive sprue cutter with the flat blade on clear parts. Also, if you're working with older kits, some clear plastic can become brittle over time and might crack if you use a sprue cutter. In those cases, I recommend using a small saw instead to be safe. Remember, you only get one chance with these parts. If you break any, it's often difficult to replace them, so always exercise extra caution. In about 99% of cases, if you cut the sprue cleanly without any cracks, you should be safe using a plastic sprue cutter. The procedure is the same as before. Cut a little away from the part, then use your sharp hobby knife to remove the remaining connection points. I hold my knife like this, but everyone is different, so find the position that works best for you. Just be very careful not to cut yourself. The knife is very sharp. Hold the blade parallel to the surface and remove material little by little. Don't try to remove everything in one go. Clear parts are usually small, and each edge has its own angle, not necessarily squared. You need to identify each edge's angle and keep your blade parallel at all times. You can always check with your finger or nail to feel if any plastic remains. Once you're done with the knife, smooth the edges with 400 grit sandpaper or preferably a hard sanding stick. You only need to clean the edges, so avoid sanding onto the front side of the glass. Take your time and work slowly to avoid any damage. Also, keep the angle consistent to avoid removing more material than necessary. The edge angle is usually around 30 degrees. Work gradually, checking with your finger for any leftover plastic, and once everything is smooth, you'll have a nicely finished part. Since these parts are very small, and sometimes it's hard to see the angles with the naked eye, I almost always use my favorite magnifying glasses for cleanup. This particular set is inexpensive and comes with different magnifying lenses from 1x to 3x. Another reason to use magnifiers is when taking close-up pictures of finished products. Any overlooked flaws will become obvious. Here's a finished, clean, transparent part. One more tip. I like to use a medication organizer for storing small parts that are easy to lose. Keep them in there with the lid closed, and you won't have to worry about losing them. Here's another tip for handling super small, clear parts. Cut only one side and leave the other side of the sprue intact. This gives you a better handle to hold onto, making it easier to work on that side without struggling to manage both at once. Now you can use both hands to clean the part safely. Just be extra careful not to cut yourself. Once one side is clean, repeat the process on the other side. And last but not least, let's talk about cleaning chrome parts. The chrome finish on this kit was done really well by the factory, and I want to keep it intact. Sometimes on other kits, chrome parts don't look as good or natural, and in those cases I usually strip the chrome off. There are a few ways to do that, but I won't cover that in this video, since I'm keeping the chrome as is. Removing chrome parts from the sprue follows the same procedure as with ordinary plastic parts. When you cut off the sprue links, part of the chrome paint will also come off. Luckily, in my case, the sprue connectors are located on areas that won't be visible once the parts are installed. So carefully remove the sprue links with a sprue cutter, then clean up the remaining nubs with a hobby knife. Take your time and work little by little. I wouldn't recommend sanding chrome parts afterward, as that could remove more chrome from the visible surfaces. Cleaning carefully with a knife should be enough to avoid exposing bare plastic. Once done, I'll dry fit the parts to check if those small spots where the chrome paint was removed are visible. Luckily, in my case, those spots are hidden behind the scenes. But if any bare plastic does show, since we're not sanding, the exposed area will be very tiny. To fix that, I use a silver or chrome marker. Just a light touch, then let it dry. Once the paint sets, that small dot practically disappears. And that wraps up the parts cleanup section. The next topic I want to cover is how to save time by gluing some parts together before painting. Specifically, parts that will be painted the same color. Obviously, it doesn't make sense to glue all parts together first, because many will have different colors, and you'd have to mask them later to get a clean finish. Of course, painting each part individually is easier for complex color schemes. A perfect example is the seat we cleaned earlier in this video. The back part of the seat will be painted the same color as the front, and since both parts are already cleaned up, we can glue them together now. Kudos to Hasegawa for including these 3 pins. This means we don't have to guess the positioning. The parts fit perfectly. For this, I like to use Tamiya Extra Thin Cement. This glue has a water-like consistency, so when applied sparingly to the seam, it penetrates and melts the plastic slightly, effectively welding the 2 surfaces together. After applying, press the parts together for about 20 to 30 seconds, then release. Repeat on the other sides as needed, but don't try to glue all sides at once. There's a risk of accidentally touching the glued surfaces and leaving permanent fingerprints, which can be very hard to fix. If done carefully, this method creates one of the cleanest glue joints possible. Just keep in mind, this glue works best on bare plastic. It doesn't adhere well to painted surfaces, and absolutely doesn't work on factory chrome parts. However, you can still use it on chrome parts if you carefully remove the chrome from the areas you want to glue. For more details on different types of glue, check out the first part of this series where I cover all the basics. The next step after all parts have been cleaned up is dry fitting each piece. All parts should fit easily into their places, leaving a little space for the paint. Remember, most of these parts are plastic and can be quite fragile. Never apply excessive pressure during assembly, or you risk breaking them, something you definitely want to avoid after putting in so much work cleaning and painting. If any additional cleanup is needed, I always make adjustments during the dry fit process. That said, this advice doesn't really apply to Tamiya kits, which are usually perfectly engineered. I've rarely needed to do any dry fitting, just to make parts fit on those kits. Another reason I dry fit, Tamiya kits included, is to explore any ideas for color changes, maybe add some carbon fiber details, or plan any modifications. However, since this is a beginner's tutorial, I won't be diving into those here. If you're wondering whether a Tamiya kit is a better choice for starting out, feel free to ask me for recommendations anytime. I won't be showing the entire dry fit process here, but you can find it in my full build videos. I'll just give you a quick overview in this one. This video is already longer than I planned. and I had intended to cover even more processes, but I'll continue those in my next video, coming up in my next tutorial. In the next part of this build, we'll organize all the parts by color, prepare everything for painting, explore the different types of paint in detail, and I'll share some of my favorite tools that make the process faster, easier, and a lot more fun. Trust me, you won't want to miss it. Good preparation can be the difference between an okay build and a truly stunning, contest-worthy model. Thank you so much for watching. And if you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing so I can keep creating more content for you to enjoy.